Chapter 1. A Princess in the Shadow. Tamar sat at the edge of the stone balcony, her linen robe fluttering gently in the breeze. Below her, the sprawling palace grounds were alive with activity. Servants bustled to and fro, carrying goods from the market, while children's laughter echoed from the courtyards. The sounds of life should have been comforting, but Tamar felt a strange restlessness. She leaned forward, her dark curls falling over her shoulders as she watched a group of young women spinning thread in the shade of the olive trees. Their laughter carried up to her, sweet and carefree. Tamar envied their simplicity. As the daughter of King David, her life was anything but simple. Growing up in the king's house meant she had been surrounded by power and privilege, yet Tamar often felt like a spectator in her own life. She was admired for her beauty and grace, praised for her piety and wisdom, but rarely did anyone see beyond the surface. Being a princess came with expectations, and Tamar fulfilled them dutifully. Never a hair out of place, never a step out of line. But beneath her serene exterior lay dreams she dared not speak aloud. She longed for love, not the kind sung by minstrels in the great hall, full of passion and tragedy, but a love rooted in understanding and faith. She yearned for a husband who would see her not just as a symbol of purity, but as a partner, a woman with thoughts and desires of her own. "Tamar!" Her handmaiden's voice broke her reverie. Turning, Tamar saw Rhea, a kind-faced woman who had served her since childhood, standing in the doorway. "Your brother Amnon has returned from the field," Rhea said. "The king has summoned everyone for the evening meal." Tamar rose gracefully, smoothing her robe. The mention of Amnon brought a slight furrow to her brow. Of all her brothers, Amnon was the most difficult to understand. He was charming and witty, yet there was something about him that made her uneasy. His attention lingered on her in ways that felt off. But Tamar dismissed the thought. He was her brother, after all. Family was to be trusted. Walking through the palace halls, Tamar's sandals made soft echoes on the polished stone floors. She passed tapestries depicting scenes of King David's victories, the woven threads glinting like gold in the fading light. She paused before one particularly vivid tapestry that depicted her father slaying Goliath. The young David, sling in hand, radiated courage and faith. Tamar often wondered if her father missed those days of simplicity when his heart had been fully devoted to God, before the weight of the crown had settled on his brow. By the time she entered the dining hall, the room was already filled with the murmur of voices. Her half-brothers and sisters were scattered around the long table, their conversations a mix of laughter and arguments. At the head of the table sat King David, his presence commanding yet weary. Tamar loved her father deeply, but she could see the toll the years and the many challenges of ruling had taken on him. Amnon sat near the king, his dark eyes flicking toward Tamar as she entered. A smile played on his lips, but it was a smile that made her stomach tighten. She forced herself to return it, keeping her expression calm and pleasant. Taking her seat beside her younger brother Absalom, she felt a wave of relief. Absalom's steady presence always comforted her. "Tamar, did you spend the afternoon praying again?" Absalom teased, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Perhaps," she replied with a smile. "Someone must pray for this family." Absalom chuckled, but his humor didn't mask the sharpness in his gaze as he glanced at Amnon. Tamar knew Absalom saw things she didn't, or perhaps things she didn't want to see. Their bond was unspoken yet deep. He was her protector, her confidant. If something troubled Absalom about Amnon, perhaps she should take note. As the meal progressed, the weight of her father's silence settled over the table. David's mind was elsewhere, his thoughts likely occupied with matters of the kingdom. Tamar stole glances at him, wishing she could ease his burden. Yet even as she sat among her family, surrounded by laughter and conversation, a sense of foreboding clung to her like a shadow. Later, as Tamar prepared for bed, she knelt by her window, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over her room. She clasped her hands and closed her eyes, her prayer flowing like a melody in her mind. Lord, guide my steps and guard my heart. Help me to be a light in this house, a servant of your will. Protect my family and give us unity and peace. She paused, her heart heavy with unspoken fears. And if there is any danger near, Lord, reveal it to me. Give me wisdom to see what I do not. As she rose and climbed into bed, Tamar couldn't shake the feeling that her life was on the brink of change. She didn't know how or why, but deep down, she sensed the threads of her story were being woven into something far greater and far more painful than she could imagine. Little did Tamar know, the storm was already brewing. Chapter 2. The Seeds of Obsession. Amnon paced his chamber, the flickering light of the oil lamp casting shadows that danced like spectres on the stone walls. His fists clenched and unclenched as he tried to focus on the scroll before him, a treatise on the laws of the kingdom. But the words blurred, meaningless and hollow. His mind was consumed by a single thought. Tamar. Her name was a melody he couldn't silence, her face a vision that haunted his waking hours. Every detail of her lingered in his memory, the way her laughter filled the halls, the gentle cadence of her voice, the grace with which she moved. She was everything pure, everything untouchable. And that was the problem. He wanted her, not as a brother should, but with a longing that clawed at him day and night. "Why do you torment yourself?" The voice of his cousin Jonadab broke through the haze of his thoughts. Amnon turned sharply, glaring at the man lounging on a low couch near the window. Jonadab's expression was one of lazy amusement, as though he took pleasure in Amnon's torment. He always seemed to appear when Amnon was at his weakest, his words like oil on fire. "You wouldn't understand," Amnon muttered, resuming his pacing. Jonadab laughed softly, a sound that grated on Amnon's nerves. "You're the king's firstborn, the heir to the throne. There's nothing you can't have. If you desire something or someone, why not take it?" Amnon froze, his back to Jonadab. The thought had crossed his mind, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a shiver down his spine. "She's my sister." Jonadab shrugged, rising to his feet and crossing the room. "Half-sister," he corrected, as if the distinction erased the moral weight of what he suggested. "And what of it? Kings and princes have bent the rules for far less." Amnon turned to face him, his expression torn between anger and desperation. "She wouldn't agree. She's too pure." Jonadab smirked, his eyes gleaming with cunning. "Then make her come to you. Create a situation where she has no choice but to care for you, to be alone with you. Women are tender-hearted, especially Tamar. She'll do anything to help her brother." Amnon's stomach churned at the suggestion, but Jonadab's words ignited a dangerous spark in his mind. "And how would you propose I do that?" Jonadab stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Feign illness. Let word spread that you are unwell. When the king comes to see you, request that Tamar tend to you. Say her presence is the only thing that will bring you comfort. She's obedient. She won't refuse. Once she's here—" He let the sentence trail off, the implications heavy in the silence. Amnon turned away, his thoughts a tangled web of desire, fear, and shame. He knew Jonadab's plan was wrong, evil even, but the desperation in his heart drowned out the voice of reason. Tamar was slipping further and further from his grasp, and he couldn't bear it. He had to have her, no matter the cost. The next morning, Amnon's servants spread word of their master's sudden illness. The news reached King David as he sat in council, his brow furrowing with concern. By the time David arrived at Amnon's chamber, the firstborn son lay feigning weakness on his couch, his face pale and voice strained. "Father," Amnon rasped, his tone pitiful, "I've been unwell for days. I cannot eat. I cannot sleep." David knelt beside him, his hand resting on Amnon's shoulder. "My son, what can I do for you? Shall I call for the physicians?" Amnon shook his head weakly. "No, father. There is only one thing that might bring me comfort. If Tamar could come and prepare food for me, if I could see her and speak with her, I believe it would lift my spirits." David hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. Though he loved all his children, he was not blind to the tension that often simmered between them. But Amnon's request seemed innocent enough, and David could not imagine his son would harbor ill intentions toward his own sister. "I will send for her," David said finally, rising to his feet. "Rest, my son. You will be well soon." As David left the room, a satisfied smile spread across Amnon's face. The plan was in motion. That evening, Tamar was summoned to her father's chambers. David explained Amnon's request with a gentle but firm tone, urging her to go at once. Tamar felt a flicker of unease. She had heard of Amnon's illness, but had not expected to be personally called upon to care for him. Still, she nodded obediently, masking her discomfort. It was her duty as a daughter, as a sister, to serve her family. She gathered a basket of ingredients from the kitchen, instructing the servants to remain behind. If Amnon was truly unwell, he would need peace and quiet. She prayed silently as she walked to his chamber, asking for wisdom and strength to fulfill her task. When she arrived, the door creaked open, and she stepped into the dimly lit room. Amnon lay on his couch, his face turned toward her, a strange glint in his eyes. Tamar hesitated, but then she forced herself to smile. "I've come to prepare a meal for you, brother," she said softly, her voice steady despite the unease tightening her chest. Amnon sat up slightly, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Thank you, Tamar. You're too kind." As she busied herself with the preparations, Tamar couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing on her task. She didn't know that with each step she took, she was drawing closer to a snare she would not escape unscathed. The seeds of obsession had taken root, and the storm was about to break. Chapter 3. A Web of Deceit. Tamar's hands moved deftly, kneading the dough with practiced precision. She hummed softly to herself, a hymn she had learned as a child. The simple act of preparing food felt calming, even in the strange tension of Amnon's chamber. She told herself that she was overthinking his behavior. He was sick, and sickness could make people act oddly. Surely her fears were unfounded. "You're so talented, Tamar," Amnon said from his couch, his voice faint, but tinged with an edge she couldn't quite place. "I've often wondered how someone with your grace and skill remains so humble." Tamar glanced over her shoulder, offering him a polite smile. "It's nothing extraordinary, brother. We all serve where we're needed." "You're more than that," Amnon replied, his gaze never leaving her. "You're radiant." The words made her pause. She searched his face, looking for the brother she thought she knew, but the intensity in his eyes made her stomach churn. She turned back to her work, focusing on shaping the dough into small cakes. "Rest, Amnon," she said lightly, trying to ease the unease creeping up her spine. "You'll need your strength when you recover." But Amnon did not rest. He watched her every movement, his mind racing. Her innocence, her kindness, it only fueled his determination. Jonadab's words echoed in his mind, a twisted justification for what he planned to do. She'll understand eventually. She'll see that this is love. When the cakes were finished, Tamar placed them on a small platter and brought them to Amnon's couch. She set the tray down and stepped back, folding her hands. "Here, brother, eat, and may it restore your strength." Amnon sat up slowly, feigning weakness. He took one cake, but instead of eating it, he set it down and looked at her. "Tamar, come closer. Feed me, as a mother would her child." Tamar hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to refuse. But she swallowed her discomfort and stepped closer, picking up a piece of the cake. As she held it out to him, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Amnon," she began, but his grip tightened, cutting off her words. "Send everyone out," he commanded, his voice suddenly strong and commanding. "There's no one here but us," she said, her voice trembling. She tried to pull away, but his grip held firm. "Please let go." His eyes darkened, and he pulled her closer. "Don't you see, Tamar? I've loved you for so long. I can't live without you." Her heart pounded, a cold wave of dread washing over her. "Amnon, this is madness. I am your sister. This is wrong before God and man." But her words only seemed to fuel his determination. "I don't care. I've tried to ignore it, tried to be patient, but I can't anymore. You belong to me." Tamar's voice rose, trembling with fear and desperation. "If you love me, you will not disgrace me. You will not sin against God or our family. Please, brother, think of what you're doing." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Amnon's desire had consumed him, blinding him to everything but his own twisted longing. He pulled her closer, ignoring her struggles and cries for help. Tamar fought with all her strength, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to stop, but he overpowered her. In the silence that followed, Tamar lay on the cold stone floor, her torn robe a stark reminder of what had been taken from her. The room, once filled with tension and unease, now felt suffocating in its stillness. Amnon sat on the couch, his expression unreadable. Tamar's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. "You have disgraced me. How will I live with this shame? Please do not send me away. Marry me, and at least some of this dishonor can be mended." Amnon looked at her with a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. "Get up and leave." Her breath caught. "What?" "I said leave," he shouted, his voice harsh and unrecognizable. "I'm done with you. Get out of my sight." Tamar's heart shattered at his words. The man who had claimed to love her now looked at her as if she were nothing more than a discarded object. She stumbled to her feet, clutching her torn robe around her, her tears falling freely. "Please, Amnon," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't send me away like this." But he called for his servant, his voice cruel and impatient. "Throw her out and bolt the door behind her." The servant appeared, his expression one of pity, as he took Tamar by the arm and led her to the door. She resisted, her cries echoing through the halls, but the servant was gentle yet firm, forcing her out into the corridor. As the door slammed shut behind her, Tamar fell to her knees, her cries of anguish piercing the air. She tore the vibrant robe that marked her as a virgin princess, her fingers trembling as she smeared ashes from a nearby brazier onto her face. The shame, the betrayal, the utter devastation, it was more than she could bear. She wandered through the palace halls, her sobs drawing the attention of servants and courtiers. Whispers began to spread, murmurs of what had transpired. By the time she reached Absalom's chambers, the weight of her grief threatened to crush her. Absalom opened the door, his face darkening as he took in her appearance. He pulled her inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. "What has happened?" he demanded, his voice low and filled with barely restrained fury. Tamar collapsed into his arms, her words coming out in broken sobs. "Amnon, he has dishonored me." Absalom's body stiffened, his jaw tightening as he held her. "Did he touch you?" he asked, though her torn robe and tear-streaked face already told him the answer. She nodded, unable to speak. The silence that followed was deadly. Absalom's hand rested on her shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice cold with rage. "I will take care of this." Tamar looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Promise me, Absalom. Promise me that justice will be done." He met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "I promise, Tamar. He will not go unpunished." As he led her to a couch and covered her with a blanket, Tamar lay down, her tears soaking the fabric. She closed her eyes, clinging to her brother's promise, even as the darkness of what had been done threatened to consume her. Absalom stood by the window, his fists clenched as he stared out into the night. The seeds of deceit had borne their bitter fruit, and now the seeds of vengeance were beginning to sprout. Chapter 4. The Shattering. Tamar sat in Absalom's chambers, staring at the thin stream of sunlight filtering through the latticework. The light fell on her hands, which rested limply in her lap. They were clean now, scrubbed raw until her skin was pink, but no amount of washing could erase the stain she felt inside. Her torn robe, a stark reminder of her shame, had been taken away, replaced by a simple garment Absalom's servants had brought her, yet the weight of her disgrace hung over her like a shroud. The door creaked open and Absalom stepped in. He had left her hours ago, his face a mask of cold fury, and now he returned with the same unreadable expression. He approached her slowly, kneeling at her side. "Tamar," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the storm she knew was brewing within him. "You must stay here, in my house. You are not to return to Amnon or father's chambers." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face etched with despair. "What good is it, Absalom? My life is ruined, my future gone. Who will ever look at me now without seeing my shame?" Absalom's jaw tightened, his hand resting gently on hers. "You are my sister, Tamar. You are more than what has been done to you. Don't let his sin define you." His words were kind, but they did little to comfort her. She pulled her hand away, clutching her arms around herself. "What will father do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Surely he will punish Amnon." Absalom's face darkened. He stood and began pacing the room, his fists clenched at his sides. "Father knows," he said bitterly. "I told him everything. But he does nothing. Nothing. He's too paralyzed by his own guilt and shame to act." Tamar's heart sank. She had hoped, prayed, that her father would seek justice, that the king who had once slain giants would stand for his daughter. But David's silence spoke louder than any words. She felt abandoned, not just by her father, but by the very system meant to protect her. "Then what is to become of me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Absalom stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression fierce. "You will stay here, under my protection. I will not let him hurt you again. And as for Amnon—" He paused, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "He will pay for what he has done. I swear it." Elsewhere in the palace, Amnon lounged in his chambers, his face a picture of indifference. He had not seen Tamar since the incident, nor had he sought to. In his mind, the event was over. He had taken what he wanted, and now it was time to move on. Jonadab entered, his smile as oily as ever. "Well, cousin, you seem unbothered. I take it things went as planned?" Amnon shrugged, a smug grin spreading across his face. She made a fuss, as women do, but she'll get over it. They always do. Jonadab chuckled, pouring himself a cup of wine from the table. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But I'd tread carefully. Absalom is not one to forget a slight, especially where his sister is concerned. Amnon waved a dismissive hand. Absalom is all talk. He won't do anything. Father won't let him. I am the firstborn, the heir to the throne. Who would dare challenge me? Jonadab raised an eyebrow, his amusement fading slightly. Just remember, cousin, even kings have fallen to the wrath of their own blood. In the days that followed, Tamar settled into her new life in Absalom's house. She rarely left her chambers, finding solace only in prayer. Her once bright spirit seemed dimmed, her laughter silenced. Yet she clung to her faith, even as questions gnawed at her heart. Why had God allowed this to happen? What purpose could there be in such pain? One evening, as she sat by the window, she heard Absalom's voice in the courtyard below. He was speaking with one of his men, his tone low and serious. She couldn't make out the words, but the weight in his voice sent a chill through her. She knew her brother well enough to sense when he was plotting something. When he entered her room later that night, his face was calm, almost too calm. He sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Tamar," he said softly, "I want you to trust me. Justice will come, but it will take time." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you planning, Absalom?" His smile was faint, almost sad. "What needs to be done? Rest now, my sister. You are safe here." Though his words were meant to comfort, they left her uneasy. Absalom's protective nature was both a blessing and a curse. She feared what his anger might drive him to do. The weeks turned into months, and the tension in David's household grew. Absalom's anger simmered beneath the surface, his interactions with Amnon cold and distant. David, caught between his love for his children and his own moral failures, avoided the subject altogether. Tamar became a shadow, seen but rarely heard, her presence a reminder of the unresolved tragedy. One day, as Tamar walked through the gardens, she overheard two servants whispering, "Have you heard? Absalom is hosting a feast for the king's sons." "A feast? Why now?" "I don't know, but he's insisted that Amnon be there." Tamar's heart raced. She hurried to Absalom's chambers, bursting in without knocking. "Absalom, what is this I hear about a feast? You've invited Amnon?" He turned to her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Yes, it's time to mend what has been broken." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "What are you planning, Absalom? Please don't do something you'll regret." He stepped closer, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Tamar, trust me. This is for you." But as she looked into his eyes, she saw no forgiveness, no peace, only the storm that had been brewing for months. Tamar realized, with a sinking heart, that the shattering of her life was not yet complete. Another storm was on the horizon, and this time it would leave no one untouched. Chapter 5. Absalom's Silent Rage. The sun was setting over Hebron, casting long shadows across Absalom's estate. The courtyard was alive with activity as servants prepared for the feast he had arranged. Tables were laden with rich foods, roasted lamb, fruits, and wine that gleamed like rubies in the golden light. On the surface, it was a celebration, a gathering of brothers, but beneath the surface, a darker purpose simmered. Absalom stood at the edge of the courtyard, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His outward composure hid the storm within him. For 2 years, he had waited, biding his time, watching as Amnon moved about the palace without remorse. He had endured the silence of his father, the whispered gossip of the courtiers, and the haunted look in Tamar's eyes. Tonight, that silence would end. Tamar watched from the balcony of her chamber, her hands gripping the railing tightly. She hadn't wanted to come to the estate for this feast, but Absalom had insisted. Now, as she looked down at the scene below, her unease grew. There was something too calculated in the way Absalom moved, his every step deliberate. Ria, her faithful handmaiden, stood beside her. "Do you think this will bring peace?" Tamar asked, her voice soft but strained. Ria hesitated before answering. "Your brother loves you deeply, my lady, but his heart burns with anger. I do not know if peace is what he seeks." Tamar closed her eyes, a prayer forming on her lips. "Lord, if justice is to come, let it be yours, not ours. Do not let us be consumed by this darkness." When the brothers arrived, Absalom greeted each one warmly, masking his true intentions with practiced ease. Even Amnon, who had avoided Absalom as much as possible in recent years, seemed to relax in the festive atmosphere. He laughed loudly, drinking more wine than he should, his confidence bolstered by the apparent reconciliation. Absalom watched him carefully, every detail noted, the slur in his speech, the flush of his cheeks, the ease with which he dismissed the weight of his crimes. Each laugh was a dagger to Absalom's resolve, sharpening his determination. When the meal was underway, Absalom raised his cup, drawing the attention of his brothers. "A toast," he announced, his voice commanding yet calm. "To our family, to unity, and to the future of our father's house." The brothers raised their cups, their voices echoing his toast. Amnon's laughter was the loudest. Absalom set down his cup and turned to one of his servants, who stood nearby, waiting for his command. "Strike Amnon," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do not hesitate." The servant's eyes widened for a moment, but he nodded, drawing a dagger from his belt. He moved quickly, before anyone could react. The blade found its mark, plunging into Amnon's chest. A gasp of shock rippled through the brothers as Amnon slumped forward, his laughter silenced forever. The courtyard erupted into chaos. The brothers leaped to their feet, some shouting, others fleeing. Servants scrambled to avoid the commotion, their faces pale with fear. But Absalom stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Amnon's lifeless body. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold, hollow emptiness. In her chamber, Tamar heard the commotion and rushed to the balcony. Below, she saw her brothers scattering, some mounting horses, others shouting for their guards. Her eyes searched desperately for Absalom, and when she finally spotted him, he was standing over Amnon's body, his face unreadable. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What has he done?" Ria placed a hand on her shoulder. "He has avenged you, my lady." Tamar shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This is not justice, this is vengeance, and it will destroy us all." By the time the news reached King David, the feast was over, and Absalom had fled. David's grief was twofold, first for Amnon, his eldest son, and then for Absalom, the son he now feared he might lose forever. The weight of his own failures pressed down on him like a millstone. He had failed Tamar, failed to bring justice, and now his family was fractured beyond repair. He sat in his chamber, his face buried in his hands. The words of the prophet Nathan echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of the judgment pronounced upon him after his sin with Bathsheba. "The sword shall never depart from your house." Absalom fled to Geshur, his mother's homeland, where he sought refuge with his grandfather. The journey was long and silent, his mind replaying the moment of Amnon's death over and over. He had thought it would bring him peace, but instead, it left him with more questions than answers. Was Tamar any safer now? Had his actions truly honored her, or had they only deepened her pain? And what of his relationship with his father? Could it ever be restored? In Geshur, Absalom found little solace. Though he was welcomed as kin, the distance from Jerusalem weighed heavily on him. He spent his days wandering the hills, his heart torn between regret and defiance. He had avenged Tamar, but at what cost? Back in Jerusalem, Tamar remained in Absalom's house, her spirit more broken than ever. She avoided the palace, avoided her father, avoiding everything that reminded her of what she had lost. She prayed often, but even her prayers felt hollow. The vengeance she had feared had come to pass, and it had brought no healing, no justice, only more pain. One night, as she knelt by her bed, she whispered a broken prayer. "Lord, I don't understand. Where is your justice? Where is your peace? My family is torn apart and I feel lost. Please show me that you are still here. Show me that this is not the end." As she wept, a faint breeze stirred the room, carrying with it a sense of something greater than her pain. It was not an answer, not yet, but it was a reminder that she was not forgotten. The threads of her life had been torn, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could still be mended. Chapter 6. A Kingdom's Blind Eye. Tamar sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the woven tapestry that hung on the far wall. The intricate patterns, once a source of comfort and fascination, now seemed meaningless. Each thread was part of a greater whole, a design she could no longer understand. The weight of silence in Absalom's house pressed heavily on her, broken only by the faint murmur of servants moving through the halls. She had heard the whispers of what had happened at the feast, how Amnon was dead by Absalom's command. Her heart, already shattered, felt as if it had been crushed further. She had prayed for justice, but not like this. This wasn't God's justice. This was blood for blood, vengeance that left scars no one could see. The door creaked open, and Rhea stepped in, carrying a tray of food. "You haven't eaten today," she said softly, setting the tray on a small table by the window. Tamar shook her head. "I'm not hungry." Rhea hesitated, then sat beside her. "You can't go on like this, my lady. You need to find strength." Amar turned to her, her eyes hollow. "What strength is there to find, Rhea? My life is ruined. Amnon is dead. Absalom is gone. My father does nothing. There is nothing left." Rhea took Tamar's hands in her own. "Your life is not over, Tamar. You are still here, and as long as you are here, God has a purpose for you." Tamar pulled her hands away, her voice trembling. "What purpose could there be in this? What good could possibly come from so much pain?" Rhea didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Sometimes there were no answers, only faith in what could not yet be seen. At the palace, King David sat in his chambers, his face lined with grief. The news of Amnon's death and Absalom's flight had shaken him deeply. He had loved Amnon, despite his sin, and his heart ached for the son he had lost. But it was Absalom's betrayal that cut the deepest. Joab, David's trusted general, entered the room and bowed. "My king, the people are restless. They speak of Absalom as both a hero and a traitor. Some say he acted righteously by avenging Tamar. Others call for his punishment. The kingdom cannot endure this division." David sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "What would you have me do, Joab? My heart is torn. Absalom is my son, but so was Amnon. How can I bring him back when I have failed Tamar so completely?" Joab stepped closer, his voice firm but respectful. "You are the king, my lord. If you do not act, the people will. Bring Absalom back from exile. Show the nation that you are still their leader, that justice and mercy can coexist." David's gaze dropped to his hands, calloused from years of battle, but now trembling with indecision. And what of Tamar? What message does this send to her? Joab paused, choosing his words carefully. Tamar needs more than justice, my lord. She needs restoration. But that begins with you, by healing this family before it tears itself apart. David closed his eyes, the weight of his failures crushing him. He had been a shepherd once, a man after God's own heart. But now he felt more like a broken reed, unable to guide his own household, let alone a kingdom. In Geshur, Absalom stood on the edge of a rocky cliff, staring out at the horizon. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the salty scent of the sea. 3 years had passed since he fled Jerusalem, and the weight of his actions lingered like a shadow. He thought often of Tamar, of the broken look in her eyes the last time he had seen her. He had acted for her, yet he wondered if he had only deepened her pain. And his father. He had once longed for David's approval, but now there was only silence between them. A servant approached, bowing deeply. "My lord, a messenger has arrived from Jerusalem." Absalom turned, his expression unreadable. "What news?" The servant handed him a scroll, sealed with the king's mark. Absalom broke the seal and read the contents, his heart pounding. David was calling him back to Jerusalem, but not to the palace. He was to remain in his own house, separated from the king. It was a half measure, neither forgiveness nor punishment. Absalom crumpled the scroll in his hand, his jaw tightening. "So, this is my father's mercy," he muttered bitterly. "An invitation to return, but only as an outcast." When Absalom returned to Jerusalem, the city buzzed with curiosity. Crowds lined the streets, eager to catch a glimpse of the prince who had defied the king. Absalom rode through the gates with his head held high, his pride masking the turmoil within him. He knew that his return would not bring the reconciliation he longed for. Not yet. Tamar watched from a window as his caravan approached. Her heart ached at the sight of him. He had always been her protector, her champion, but now he seemed like a stranger. When he entered the house, she went to him, her steps hesitant. "Absalom," she said softly. He turned to her, his expression softening for the first time in years. "Tamar." She stepped closer, studying his face. "Why did you come back?" He gave a bitter smile. "Because father called for me, though he doesn't truly want me here." Tamar's eyes filled with tears. "I prayed for your safety every day, but I fear what will come of this." Absalom placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, Tamar, I will never stop fighting for you." But Tamar wasn't sure if she believed him anymore. She saw the hardness in his eyes, the pride that had grown in the soil of his pain. Absalom's rage, though quiet, was still burning, and she feared it would consume them all. King David, watching from a distance, felt his heart break anew. He longed to embrace Absalom, to heal the rift between them, but his guilt and pride held him back. Instead, he prayed silently, asking God to restore his family, even as the cracks in their foundation deepened. The kingdom had turned a blind eye to justice, and now the seeds of discord were sprouting. Tamar's pain had been ignored, Absalom's wrath had been fueled, and David's silence had allowed it all to fester. The storm that began with Tamar's shattering was far from over, and its final reckoning loomed on the horizon. Chapter 7. Healing Broken Threads. Tamar awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the latticework of her chamber window. The air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine from the gardens below. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the gentle cooing of doves nesting nearby. It was a new day, yet the weight of the past lingered like a shadow. Rising slowly, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window. The city of Jerusalem stretched out before her, rooftops bathed in golden light. Life went on. Merchants setting up their stalls, children chasing one another through the narrow streets, women drawing water from the well. Tamar watched them, a pang of longing piercing her heart. She felt disconnected, as if a veil separated her from the world she once knew. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Enter," she called gently. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman, her face lined with years, but her eyes bright with warmth. "Good morning, my lady," she said with a slight bow. "I am Miriam, recently appointed to serve you." Tamar offered a faint smile. "Good morning, Miriam. Please, you needn't stand on formality with me." Miriam stepped inside, carrying a tray with fresh bread, honey, and a steaming cup of herbal tea. She set it on a small table near the window. "I thought you might like to break your fast here, where the view is pleasant." "Thank you," Tamar replied, touched by the woman's thoughtfulness. She sat at the table, and Miriam poured the tea with steady hands. "Is there anything else you require?" Miriam asked, her gaze gentle. Tamar hesitated. There was a kindness in Miriam's eyes that invited trust. "Would you stay a while? I find the mornings quiet." Miriam nodded and took a seat opposite her. "Of course, my lady." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments. Tamar sipped her tea, the fragrant herbs soothing her senses. Finally, she spoke. "How long have you been in Jerusalem, Miriam?" "All my life," Miriam replied, with a soft smile. "I was born in the lower city, not far from the temple. My husband was a scribe in the royal archives before he passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Tamar said sincerely. "Thank you," Miriam said, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and peace. "He was a good man. The Lord gave us many years together, and for that, I am grateful." Tamar studied the lines on Miriam's face, each one telling a story of love, loss, and endurance. "You seem to carry your burdens with such grace. How do you find the strength?" Miriam reached across the table and gently touched Tamar's hand. "My dear, the strength is not mine, but the Lord's. He sustains me each day. In Him, I find comfort and purpose." A lump formed in Tamar's throat. "There are days when I feel so lost, so broken. I wonder if I will ever feel whole again." Miriam's gaze held a depth of understanding. "Wounds of the heart and soul take time to heal, but remember, broken threads can be woven into a new tapestry, different perhaps, but no less beautiful." Tamar felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know where to begin." "Begin with small steps," Miriam advised gently. "Seek the Lord in prayer. Surround yourself with those who uplift your spirit. And when you're ready, extend kindness to others. In serving, we often find healing." Over the following weeks, Tamar took Miriam's words to heart. She began each day in prayer, pouring out her fears, her doubts, and her hopes to the Lord. At first, the prayers felt strained, like a language she had forgotten. But gradually, they flowed more freely, becoming a source of solace. One afternoon, as she walked through the gardens, Tamar noticed a young girl crouched by a rosebush, sobbing quietly. Concerned, she approached. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. The girl looked up, hastily wiping her tears. "I'm sorry, my lady. I didn't mean to disturb you." "There's no need to apologize," Tamar assured her. "What's your name?" "Leah," the girl replied, her eyes red and puffy. "Leah, would you like to tell me what's troubling you?" The girl hesitated before confessing, "I broke one of the palace's pottery jars while carrying water. I'm afraid I'll be punished." Tamar smiled gently. "Accidents happen. Let's go together and explain. I'm sure we can make it right." Leah looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You would do that for me?" "Of course," Tamar said, taking the girl's hand. "We all need a little help sometimes." As they walked back, Tamar felt a small spark of purpose ignite within her. Helping Leah had lifted her own spirits in a way she hadn't expected. Word of Tamar's kindness began to spread among the servants and staff. She took time to listen to their concerns, offered comfort to those in distress, and even organized a small group to mend clothing and prepare meals for the less fortunate in the city. One day, Miriam found Tamar sorting through fabrics in a storage room. "You seem busy," she remarked with a smile. Tamar looked up, her eyes brighter than they had been in a long time. "I'm preparing garments for the children in the orphanage near the East Gate. Winter will be upon us soon." Miriam nodded approvingly. "It's good work you're doing." "It feels meaningful," Tamar admitted. "For so long, I've been consumed by my own pain, but seeing how even small acts can make a difference, it helps me heal." Miriam placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are weaving new threads into your life, Tamar. The Lord is using you to bless others." One evening, as the sun cast hues of pink and orange across the sky, Tamar sat in the courtyard, a harp resting in her lap. She hadn't played since before the tragedy, but tonight she felt drawn to music once more. Her fingers moved hesitantly over the strings at first, but soon a gentle melody filled the air, a song of lament mingled with hope. Servants paused in their duties to listen, the haunting tune resonating within their hearts. Absalom, returning from a meeting, heard the music and stopped at the entrance of the courtyard. He watched his sister from a distance, a mixture of sadness and admiration in his eyes. It had been so long since he'd seen her this at peace. After she finished, he approached quietly. "That was beautiful," he said softly. Tamar turned, a hint of surprise on her face. "Thank you. It's been a while since I've played." He took a seat beside her. "I've missed hearing you play." They sat in silence for a moment before Tamar spoke. "Absalom, how are you truly?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm managing. There's much unrest in the city. Father's decisions, or lack thereof, weigh heavily on the people." "And on you," Tamar added gently. He nodded. "I wish things were different." "So do I," she agreed. "But perhaps we can be a part of the change we wish to see." He glanced at her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've found healing in serving others," Tamar explained. "Maybe if we focus on helping those around us, we can bring some light into the darkness." Absalom considered her words. "You have a good heart, Tamar. The kingdom could use more of your compassion." She smiled softly. "We all have a role to play. Promise me you'll think about it." He gave a small nod. "I will." As the months passed, Tamar continued her acts of kindness, slowly becoming a quiet influence within the community. Women sought her counsel, children ran to greet her, and even the elders spoke of her with respect. One day, a messenger arrived from the palace requesting her presence. Surprised, Tamar prepared herself and made her way to her father's chambers. King David stood by the window when she entered, his gaze distant. "Tamar," he said, turning to face her, "thank you for coming." She bowed her head slightly. "You requested to see me, father?" He gestured for her to sit. "I've heard of the work you've been doing, the lives you've touched. I'm proud of you." Tamar studied his face, noting the lines of weariness and regret. "Thank you." He hesitated before continuing. "I know I've failed you in many ways. I've allowed my own shortcomings to prevent me from being the father you needed." Her eyes softened. "We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we move forward." He nodded slowly. Wise words. I've been thinking. Perhaps we can work together to restore what has been broken, not just in our family, but in the kingdom. Tamar felt a flicker of hope. I would like that. In the days that followed, Tamar began collaborating with palace officials to expand her charitable efforts. She organized relief for the poor, advocated for justice on behalf of the oppressed, and worked to heal divisions within the community. Her own healing journey became a source of inspiration for others. She spoke openly about finding strength in faith, the importance of forgiveness, and the power of compassion. Miriam watched her with pride. You have become a beacon, Tamar, she remarked one afternoon. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, Tamar replied gratefully. Miriam shook her head. The strength was always within you. The Lord merely used me to help you see it. Tamar smiled, a genuine warmth radiating from her. I am beginning to understand that even the broken threads of our lives can be woven into something new. Exactly, Miriam agreed. And the new tapestry may be even more beautiful for the trials we've endured. As Tamar looked out over the city, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The wounds of her past were still there, but they no longer defined her. She was forging a new path, one of purpose, resilience, and hope. The healing had begun, and with it, the possibility of a future she could embrace. Chapter 8. The Storm of Vengeance. The palace was unusually quiet the night Absalom called his closest advisers to his private chambers. The torches on the walls flickered against the cold stone, casting long, wavering shadows. Absalom sat at the head of a low table, his posture relaxed, but his expression grim. Around him were men he trusted, not for their loyalty to the crown, but for their loyalty to him. We've waited long enough, Absalom said, his voice low and steady. The kingdom is divided, and the people are restless. My father's inaction has allowed the cracks in our family to deepen. The time has come for a change. The men nodded, their eyes glinting with the promise of power. Absalom had spent years cultivating their support, appealing to their frustrations with David's rule. They saw in him a leader who would not hesitate to act. What is your plan, my lord? One of them asked. Absalom leaned forward, his fingers steepled. We will go to Hebron. There, I will declare myself king. The people will rally to me, and together we will march on Jerusalem. But what of your father? Another adviser asked cautiously. Do you believe the people will turn against him? Absalom's jaw tightened. The people are tired of his weakness. They want strength, decisiveness, qualities my father no longer possesses. They will follow me because I offer what he cannot: justice. His voice carried the weight of conviction, but deep down, Tamar's face lingered in his mind. He had promised her healing, a better future, yet the path he had chosen was not one of healing. It was a path of rebellion, born out of anger and pride. Tamar heard the whispers before she saw the evidence. Servants murmured in the corridors about Absalom's growing influence, about the men who came and went under the cover of night. She confronted him one evening in the courtyard, where he was sharpening his sword. Absalom, she began, her tone firm. What are you planning? He glanced up, his expression softening briefly before the mask of determination returned. Tamar, you don't need to concern yourself with this. I do, she insisted, stepping closer. I've seen the way you move through the palace, the way men whisper your name. You're preparing for something, aren't you? Absalom set down his sword, rising to his full height. I'm preparing to take what is rightfully mine. The kingdom cannot thrive under father's rule any longer. Tamar's eyes widened, fear creeping into her voice. You're talking about rebellion. I'm talking about justice, he corrected sharply. For you, For me, for the people. Justice. Tamar shook her head, her voice trembling. This isn't justice, Absalom. This is pride. This is vengeance. Do you think this will heal our family? Do you think this will bring peace? His face darkened, and he stepped closer, his voice lowering. Peace cannot come without justice, and justice cannot come without action. Tamar's heart broke as she looked at him, the brother who had once been her protector, now consumed by ambition. Absalom, please, don't do this. There's still time to make things right without tearing our family apart. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it passed quickly. You don't understand, Tamar. This is bigger than us. I understand more than you think, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I understand that you're about to lose yourself in this. He reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but stopped short. I'm doing this for us. For you. No, she said firmly. You're doing this for you. The following week, Absalom left for Hebron, taking with him a growing number of supporters. Tamar watched from the balcony as his caravan disappeared into the horizon, her heart heavy with sorrow. She prayed for him daily, pleading with God to turn his heart back before it was too late. Word soon reached Jerusalem of Absalom's declaration. Crowds gathered in the streets, divided between loyalty to King David and support for Absalom. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of war. David's reaction was one of heartbreak and resignation. He called his most trusted men to him, including Joab, and prepared to flee the city. If Absalom wishes to take the throne, I will not fight him here, David said. We will leave Jerusalem to spare the people. Joab frowned, but did not argue. The king's weariness was evident, his years of rule marked by victories and failures alike. As David's household prepared to leave, Tamar stood in the courtyard, her heart torn in two. Father, she said, approaching him as he mounted his horse, you don't have to go. You can fight for what is yours. David looked down at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. This is not my kingdom, Tamar. It belongs to the Lord. If it is his will that Absalom rule, then so be it. Tears welled in her eyes. And if it's not his will, what then? David's gaze softened. Then he will restore what has been taken. Trust in him, my daughter. As David and his retinue left the city, Absalom entered triumphantly. The streets were lined with supporters shouting his name, hailing him as the new king. But not all voices joined in the celebration. There were those who watched in silence, their loyalty to David unshaken. Tamar remained in the palace, her presence largely unnoticed in the chaos. She prayed fervently, seeking God's guidance and protection. She longed for reconciliation, for the storm to pass without further destruction. But deep down, she knew the storm had only just begun. In Hebron, Absalom stood before his assembled men, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. He had achieved what he had set out to do, but the victory felt hollow. Tamar's words haunted him, her voice a reminder of the price he was paying. Your time has come, my lord, one of his generals said, breaking his thoughts. Jerusalem is yours. Absalom nodded, forcing a smile. Yes, it is. But as he gazed out over the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that his triumph was built on fragile ground. The threads of vengeance he had woven were beginning to unravel, and the consequences would soon follow. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The streets of Jerusalem were eerily silent. Tamar stood by a window in the palace, looking out over the city that now felt like a stranger to her. Absalom had taken the throne, but his victory was shadowed by unease. The people whispered behind closed doors, their loyalty to King David simmering beneath the surface. Tamar felt the tension in every stone of the palace, in every glance exchanged by servants too afraid to speak openly. Absalom moved through the halls with the air of a king, but his steps lacked the confidence she once saw in him. His pride had carried him this far, but Tamar knew pride alone could not sustain him. She prayed daily for him, but her prayers were now tinged with desperation. She could see the cracks forming, and she feared the weight of his choices would soon crush him. Absalom sat on the throne in the great hall, his advisers surrounding him. He had expected to feel triumphant, yet his heart was heavy. Every decision he made felt like a battle between the man he wanted to be and the man he was becoming. One of his generals stepped forward. "My lord, the people are uneasy. They do not trust your rule as they trusted King David." Absalom's jaw tightened. "Then we must show them strength. Let them see that I am a leader who will not falter." "But strength alone will not win their hearts," another adviser said cautiously. "You must show mercy as well." Absalom waved a hand dismissively. "Mercy will come when they no longer question me. For now, they must know that I am in control." The advisers exchanged uneasy glances but said no more. They could see the turmoil in their king, but they knew better than to challenge him. Tamar found Absalom in the courtyard that evening, pacing near the fountain. She approached him hesitantly, her heart aching at the sight of his furrowed brow and clenched fists. "Absalom," she said softly. He turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Tamar, I didn't expect to see you tonight." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "There's too much unrest in the city, and in this house." Absalom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But I'm doing everything I can to hold it together." She stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe that's the problem. You're trying to hold it together on your own. You need to seek the Lord's guidance, Absalom. You can't do this alone." He looked away, his jaw tightening. The Lord's guidance? Where was his guidance when Amnon dishonored you? Where was his justice? Tamar's heart broke at the bitterness in his voice. His justice isn't always immediate, but it is always right. You've taken matters into your own hands, and look where it's led us. Absalom turned back to her, his eyes flashing with anger. "I did what needed to be done. No one else would act, not father, not anyone. I had no choice." "You had a choice," Tamar said firmly. "And you still do. It's not too late to turn back." He shook his head, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's already too late, Tamar. The path is set." She wanted to argue, to plead with him, but she could see the walls around his heart. Instead, she placed a hand on his arm. "I will keep praying for you, Absalom." He didn't respond, but as she walked away, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or doubt. David's forces gathered in the wilderness, preparing to retake Jerusalem. Though David himself was weary, his men were steadfast in their loyalty. Joab stood at his side, a map spread out before them. "Absalom has the city, but he does not have the people," Joab said. "They follow him out of fear, not love. If we strike quickly, we can end this before it becomes a full-scale war." David nodded, his face lined with sorrow. "I do not want bloodshed, Joab. Absalom is still my son." Joab's expression hardened. "Your son has declared himself king, my lord. He has left you no choice." David closed his eyes, his heart heavy. "Then we must proceed. But spare him, Joab. If it comes to that, spare Absalom." Joab's silence was telling, but he nodded. "As you wish." The day of battle arrived swiftly. Tamar watched from the palace as Absalom's forces marched out to meet David's army. The streets were quiet, the people hiding in their homes, their prayers mingling with their fear. She knelt in her chamber, her hands clasped tightly. Lord, protect them. Protect my father, my brother. Stop this before more blood is shed. Please, Lord, let your will be done. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Finally, a servant came to her chamber, his face pale. My lady, the battle is over. Tamar rose quickly. And Absalom? What of my brother? The servant hesitated, his eyes filling with sorrow. He is gone. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. No, she whispered. No, this can't be. He was caught in the forest, my lady. His hair, it became entangled in the branches. The soldiers found him, and the words blurred, her mind refusing to process them. She had prayed for peace, for reconciliation, but the storm had claimed her brother. Absalom, her protector, her friend, was gone. When David returned to the palace, his grief was raw and uncontained. He tore his robes, crying out, "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! Would that I had died instead of you!" Tamar stood in the shadows, her own tears falling silently. She wanted to comfort her father, but her own grief was too great. The storm that had begun with Amnon's sin had reached its tragic end, leaving their family broken. Yet even in her sorrow, she clung to the faint hope that healing was still possible. The threads of their lives had been torn apart, but perhaps, in time, the Lord could weave them into something new. For now, all she could do was pray. Chapter 10. Restoring the Robe. The palace was quiet in the weeks following Absalom's death. The air felt heavy with grief, a tangible reminder of the loss that had shattered King David's household. Tamar moved through the halls like a ghost, her presence acknowledged but rarely addressed. She had always been a symbol of grace and purity, but now she carried the weight of a family's brokenness. One morning, she sat by the loom in her chamber, her hands brushing over the vibrant threads that had once brought her joy. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a shuttle and began to weave. It had been years since she'd touched the loom. The simple act was both painful and cathartic, a way to process the grief and guilt that weighed on her heart. The threads began to form a pattern, deep reds, soft blues, and vibrant golds. Each color carried a meaning, red for pain, blue for faith, and gold for hope. Tamar poured her heart into the work, the rhythmic motion of the loom, a balm for her soul. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Miriam entered, her kind eyes filled with concern. "You've been working all morning, my lady. You should rest." Tamar shook her head. "I can't rest, Miriam. Not when there's so much to be done." Miriam approached, her gaze falling on the half-finished tapestry. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "A reflection of your heart, I think." Tamar smiled faintly. It's a way to make sense of the chaos, to take something broken and create something new. Miriam placed a hand on her shoulder. "The Lord has given you a gift, Tamar, not just with the loom, but with your spirit. You've endured so much, yet you continue to seek healing for yourself and for others." Tamar turned to her, tears brimming in her eyes. "But what if it's not enough? What if the brokenness is too great?" Miriam's voice was steady. "Nothing is too broken for the Lord to restore. He is the master weaver, and he can take even the most tattered threads and create something beautiful." Inspired by Miriam's words, Tamar began to work not only on her own healing, but also on that of those around her. She organized gatherings for the women of the palace, providing them a safe space to share their struggles and support one another. She visited the orphanages and the poor, bringing food, clothing, and compassion. Slowly, her actions began to ripple through the city. One day, she found herself at the temple, her heart heavy with thoughts of her father. David had withdrawn from public life, his grief over Absalom consuming him. Tamar knelt in the outer court, her hands clasped in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "heal my father's heart. Help him see that he is still the shepherd of your people, that his story is not over." When she rose, she found herself face to face with Nathan the prophet. His gaze was piercing yet kind. "The Lord hears your prayers, Tamar," he said. She bowed her head. "And what does he say?" Nathan's voice was steady. "He says your faith pleases him, and he is not finished with your family. You are a light in this house, Tamar. Continue to shine, for through you the Lord will bring healing." Tamar returned to the palace with a renewed sense of purpose. She sought out her father, finding him in the garden where he often retreated to play his harp. His fingers plucked a mournful melody, his eyes distant. "Father," she said softly, approaching him. David looked up, his face lined with sorrow. "Tamar, my child." She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You've always found comfort in music," she said. "Do you remember the songs you used to teach us as children?" A faint smile touched his lips. "I do." Tamar hesitated before continuing. "Father, I know your heart is heavy, but the people need you. I need you. You are still the king, and there is still work to be done." David set down his harp, his gaze meeting hers. "I've failed you all, Tamar. I failed you, Absalom, Amnon, everyone." "You didn't fail me," she said firmly. "You're here. That's enough." David reached for her hand, his grip trembling. "You've always been strong, my daughter, stronger than I ever knew." Tamar smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "That strength comes from the Lord, Father, and it's a strength you have too." Over time, David began to emerge from his grief. Tamar continued to be a steady presence at his side, offering wisdom and compassion. Together, they worked to rebuild the trust of the people and restore harmony to the kingdom. One day, as Tamar walked through the city, she came across a group of young women weaving in the marketplace. They paused as she approached, their faces lighting up with recognition. "Lady Tamar," one of them said, bowing deeply, "we've heard of your kindness. You've inspired many of us." Tamar smiled warmly. "It is the Lord who inspires. I am merely his servant." She knelt beside them, picking up a piece of fabric. "May I?" The women nodded eagerly, watching as Tamar demonstrated a technique for weaving intricate patterns. Her hands moved deftly, the act bringing her a sense of peace. When she finished, she held up the fabric, the design a vibrant blend of colors. "Each thread has a purpose," she said, her voice steady. "Even the ones that seem insignificant. Together, they create something beautiful." The women nodded, their admiration clear. Tamar rose, her heart full. The tapestry of her life was far from complete, but she knew now that every thread, every triumph, every tragedy had a place in God's plan. In the years that followed, Tamar's legacy grew. She became known as a woman of wisdom and compassion, a reflection of God's grace amid the brokenness of her family. The tapestry she wove in her chamber became a symbol of hope, displayed in the palace as a reminder of the beauty that could come from pain. And though the scars of the past remained, Tamar found peace in the knowledge that her story, like her family's, was part of something far greater than she could ever imagine. The robe of her life, once torn, had been restored, its threads woven into a design of resilience, faith, and redemption.